Hello, everyone. Welcome to another issue of The Internationalist. I'm so pleased to introduce investigative journalist Matt Kennard, who's joining us again today after a year of us introducing these video issues. And today he's discussing the newest edition of his book, The Racket, a rogue reporter versus the American Empire. Thank you so much for joining us, Matt.
Thanks. It's good to be back.
Of course. So let's begin by talking about the genesis of this book, how it took shape and why it's a necessary read in our current times.
Yeah, so basically the book is an investigation of the US empire, which is the most powerful empire in history. If you're talking about its extent and its military prowess. And it all began really when I was working at the Financial Times, because I worked for the Financial Times. I started in 2009 and worked there for 3 years and was posted to Washington, New York, London. And basically I had access to all the power players in this empire, effectively, which is an Anglo-American empire as well. The British Empire, which everyone says collapsed after the Second World War, never really did collapse. Britain reformulated itself as an adjunct to the American empire, but it does play a crucial role. So anyway, while I was there, my politics were never very different to how they are now, or my view of journalism, but I realized I couldn't do the journalism that I wanted to do at the Financial Times to really expose this empire. But I knew I had this access, which I wouldn't get again. So I used those years when I was there to really gather testimony and gather information from the coalface about how the empire works, with the thought that maybe when I leave, I could write it up into a book and fill in the blanks. Because essentially the book goes to different countries and discusses different issues. So, for example, Haiti after the earthquake, Bolivia under Evo Morales, Honduras after the coup in 2009. And I was able to gather information from the power brokers in society, in those places, like US ambassadors, because of my affiliation to the Financial Times. But I wasn't allowed to publish in the Financial Times the truth about what was happening there. So essentially the book is about me filling in the blanks, and what I used a lot to do that was the WikiLeaks cables, which were released in 2010 and 11. Now they are the most important documents we have that really expose the reality of how the US manages the world. And it was amazing to cross-reference what I was told by power brokers, US ambassadors, State Department officials, Obama administration officials, and cross-reference that with what they were saying in private, or what other officials were saying in private. And often they're completely contradictory, because they're not speaking to the public in those cables. They're speaking to people also on the inside. So they're much more honest about what's going on. And so, yeah, so the book really is a blowing the whistle, effectively, but also on the media, because this system is allowed to operate so freely because it's not exposed. The reality of what it does around the world, the US empire, is not exposed, number one. Number two, the media just regurgitates all the propaganda which has been created to justify this empire to the world, as all previous empires justified themselves to the world, that they were doing wonderful things, and what's called American exceptionalism. You know, like we're different to all previous empires because we're interested in values and democracy and freedom and human rights. It's complete rubbish. So I wanted to use the information I had from the inside to really expose that. And the book opens in Haiti, and it's kind of maybe the emblematic example of that, because Haiti's been under US control for over a century. There was an invasion in the early 20th century in 1915. They didn't leave till 1934, and effectively in the whole period since, they've been under US control. And I was sent by the Financial Times to Haiti after the earthquake in 2010, which was devastating. And I was able to go. I was taken around by the World Bank. I was taken around by the IMF to see what the US was doing. And I was talking to the US ambassador, And effectively, it is kind of like maybe the parable for how it all works, because what I was told was that, okay, Haiti, this is an awful tragedy, but this is a chance to make Haiti's future different to its past. But it was all done on the terms of the United States, and it was all done to implement a plan they'd had previously, but not been allowed to enforce because of various different domestic issues and political issues. They wanted to turn Haiti basically into a Caribbean sweatshop, to create special economic zones which would attract foreign investment and foreign companies to come to these zones which are completely walled off from the rest of society, and then work for peanuts, because the US was saying, well, the best thing about Haiti is it's got low labor costs. So they wanted to use that as a way to develop the country. They wanted to destroy small-scale farming, which obviously goes back a long time in Haiti. And actually, Clinton had started doing that in the 90s by dumping loads of cheap US rice. Anyway, so I was taken to these SEZs, special economic zones. I was taken to these little to these companies which had been funded by the International Finance Corporation, the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, and it was all a wonderful picture that they were painting. They were like, we're doing amazing things for the Haitians. But then I left and started looking into the cables about what they were talking about in Haiti. And it showed that the US embassy were really angry at the government for not initiating a completely full-scale privatization of the country before the earthquake. And it also showed, obviously, there was a coup in Haiti in 2004 when Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was a priest and a social democrat, not super radical, but he wanted to do some good things for the poor in the country, not allowed. So the US took him out. He was put on a plane to Central African Republic. And yeah, so I looked at, I read every single cable effectively from like 2000 to 2010, sent from Port-au-Prince to Washington. And I think, and I bring up Haiti because it opens the book, and I think it is a very good case. And the reason I chose it to open the book is it's kind of like the emblematic case. But that kind of methodology that I used, where I used the testimony from the power brokers in the US empire and cross-reference it with the WikiLeaks cables, happens all through the book. So that it was a conscious decision on my part that I wanted to write this book even while I was at the FT, which is why I think it is kind of a whistleblowing, or not traditional, because I didn't sign any National Security Act, but you never would get normally a Financial Times journalist even thinking of doing something like that, and that's how the propaganda system works. No one even thinks that there's a truth that they're not seeing.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned the whistleblowing, because I mean, of course, it's the question that I want to approach next. But also what you said about all of this information not being available, it's something that's really, really tricky. Because even when I feel like government puts this information out through, these policy briefs, the language is so difficult. It's so shrouded in so much technicality that somebody like me who doesn't have the kind of training to pass through those documents, I would never be able to understand the extent of the crimes of empires like the US. And then yes, of course, I mean, I also agree with you. This book was, when I was reading it, was like, you are whistleblowing essentially. And a part of me was also worried. I was wondering if you've gotten into trouble because of what you've written. But you dedicate this book to Chelsea Manning, whom we all know played a crucial role in exposing US military war crimes and then was persecuted for it. And similarly, Aaron Swartz, similarly, Julian Assange. And I mean, all of them have made, extraordinary contributions to what we are now talking about, public knowledge, which is so essential for us to understand our democratic rights, I think. And all of them have faced severe persecution at every point in their life. Julian Assange, after so many years, was finally allowed to go back home this year. So, I mean, just sort of like an ideological questions, I think, but what do you think are the societal and institutional forces that drive this persecution despite the work that they're doing? And, what lessons can we maybe draw from their courage and sacrifice?
Well, I mean, the forces that targeted and probably will continue to target Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange particularly is the infrastructure of the US empire. So the CIA, the Pentagon, the White House, the Department of Justice, they're all signed up to this imperial system. And the significance of what they did was they exposed Chelsea Manning through leaking and Julian Assange through publishing the US empire on a scale that had never been done before. In fact, no empire had ever been exposed on that level before. And actually, if you had a press that was interested in actually informing the public about how the world works and saw that as their goal, they would have celebrated both of them as heroes. And in fact, I was in the Washington bureau of the Financial Times when the first cable started coming out. And I remember that the journalists were just angry about it effectively. And that was a real like eureka moment for me, because for me, it was super exciting that there was this opening for people to understand how the world really works and the US role within it, because the US role in the world is heavily propagandized, and our role as journalists is to see through that, or at least reveal the truth. So that was and that is why they were targeted, because journalists, publishers are not meant to do that. Their role is to basically regurgitate propaganda in the system, and the system operates by allowing a free press, because the free press never touches the systemic issues. It covers scandals, it covers frothy issues on top of the system. But as soon as you start delving into the reality of how the system works, well, you go to where Julian Assange went, which was Belmarsh maximum security prison. And it's actually kind of a miracle that he got out. I didn't think he would, because the forces that were rained against him were some of the most powerful forces in the world in history. Like the CIA is very, very powerful within Washington, and he embarrassed them. He also embarrassed the Pentagon, and he revealed the truth about what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. These things are red lines for the empire, because you have to understand that the empire would have to pack its bags and shut down within a couple of months if the population was really informed by the press about what it is. It only gets away with it because they don't know. People don't know. If we were revealing the truth about the number of dead in Afghanistan, the number of war crimes in Iraq, it would have been much more pressure within the United. There would be much more pressure inside the United States. Obviously, they did reveal that, and it actually did bring about probably earlier withdrawal than there would have been in Iraq. And then just to go back to another case, which was Daniel Ellsberg during the Vietnam War with the Pentagon Papers, that had a big impact on bringing that war to an end early, and that was the New York Times. So you can see that, like, the powers that be know that they need to keep this information secret because they don't want their population to be informed about what they're doing. They want to have a secret state so they can carry out all sorts of atrocities in private, in our name, but actually with no oversight from us or any kind of parliamentary body. So that the significance of what they did is huge. And I think that both of them will be seen as heroes, historic heroes for informing us of how our world works. Because, as I say, the US empire is the overriding dynamic to understand international affairs. Their fingerprints are everywhere. If you're looking at regime change operations in Venezuela, you're looking at Gaza, you're looking at East Asia, everywhere. The US will have a big role in what is happening there. So if we so to have the conversations they were having going back decades is an amazing resource, and it's so exposing of the media and academia as well, that you hardly ever see references to the WikiLeaks cables in any media articles, because any article, even about a contemporary issue, often has some background in it. Now, if you want the background to that issue, and it's an international affairs issue, you can go straight to those cables and find out what the reality of it is, not the propagandized historians or the propagandized journalists give it, but yet you barely ever see it referenced. So I would say that their significance is huge. Their enemies were the American state, basically all parts of it, because they exposed it. And the fact that they're free the fact that Edward Snowden, he's not free, but he is free, but he's in Russia, he can't go home, is an amazing thing, and it should give everyone hope that people who reveal truth tellers can survive, because what they want to do is destroy these people. And Assange, I'll just finish with this. Assange is an interesting case because not many people could survive, even though he's free now. Not many people could survive what he has survived, which is 7 years in the embassy, then 5 years in maximum security Belmarsh prison in London, which is a hellhole. It's called Britain's Guantanamo. Bear in mind, he's never been charged with a violent offence. It makes no sense he was put there. But what it was about breaking him and destroying him, because he wasn't only held there, he was held there with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in some concrete coffin in the middle of the Colorado desert. Not many people could put up with that for years on end, you know. And he's got 2 little kids that he'd never seen as a free man. So the fact he survived, the fact he's free, is a major victory for humanity, for truth, and for journalism. And I think it should inspire the final part of your question was about what should we take from their sacrifice and courage, and we should take courage is contagious. If you look at the repression that many, and the violence that many people in the world are living under, we have a degree of freedom in the UK, in the US, in most of Europe, that they don't have, and they're at the butt end of our imperial system. So we should step up. If we're not using that freedom to really reveal the truth about the system, then we're not doing our job right as journalists, and we're also not being moral individuals. Because look at Gaza, for example. I mean, those people basically are living in an extermination camp with no way out, and have been for 11 months, and so they can't. And they're brave enough. There's journalists there who are getting killed en masse, who are still going out and reporting on the atrocities. So if we can't just actually say the truth in the face of a system which is nowhere near as repressive and nowhere near as murderous yet domestically, then we're not doing our job right.
I think what you said, that courage is contagious, I think, yeah, that's a really powerful line, I think, and gives you a lot to think about as well. And just to come back to what you said about the US propaganda, because after reading your chapters on Haiti and Honduras, I do remember also reading this in your previous book, The Silent Coup, that all of these efforts were sort of disguised as aid efforts. And this is also part of the propaganda machinery, which is also then sold to us also in India. And, you know, I'm sure in other countries like us as well, you know, like you said, the US fingerprints are all over the globe. And especially in vulnerable countries like ours, I mean, India, not so much, because of the friendly relations we sometimes share with the US. But yeah, I can see in Bangladesh right now with the student protests that are going on, and the interim government trying to sort of make sense of, you know, how the relationship with the US is going to look like, because a lot of the media there, and also the Indian media, sort of like indulged in fear mongering as the student protests were going on. So I just wanted to know if you would like to talk a little bit about what was actually happening in Haiti and Honduras, as you've already sort of underlined in your book as well. Just telling us the devastating impacts of this US interventionism, and, you know, the sheer consequences, the violent consequences of American foreign policy, and, you know, just their abject greed.
Yeah, well, I mean, the 2 cases you mentioned, Honduras and Haiti, I mean, the lesson of those 2 countries is that the US, whenever hope arises anywhere for a different way of doing things, i.e. a government representing its people and using its resources for its own people rather than foreign corporations, the US will come in and smash that hope to pieces. Now, I talked a bit about the Haiti case. That was John Bertrand Aristide, who was elected in 1990 and was the first ever democratic president of Haiti. And he was taken out twice in 2 coups. Well, he left in 91, 94, then 2004. The 2004 one, he was sent to Central African Republic, as I mentioned, and his party, Lavalas, he can never stand. But that was an amazing moment in Haitian history, because he wasn't expected to win that initial election, and he was a very decent human being, a priest, but a liberation priest who preached for the poor, and he wanted to do small differences, do things differently, raise the minimum wage, nationalize companies, and the US, what did they do? They took him out, and that also happened in Honduras. In Honduras, there was a coup in 2009, which was just before I went to the country. And Manuel Zelaya was the president, and he had raised the minimum wage by 60% overnight. I think it was about $300 a month. It wasn't a lot anyway. And he'd done various other small social democratic reforms, or maybe was promising to do them. And again, too much for the United States. He was taken out in a coup. He was in his pajamas, flown to detain in a police raid of his house. He was detained in his pajamas. This is the president. He was flown to Costa Rica, where he was put in exile, and then the country was handed over to the oligarchs and the domestic elite, which worked with the United States to keep all the great unwashed of Latin America under their boot, and they worked closely with the American empire. And within years, it became the most dangerous country in the whole of the world per capita, not just in Latin America. And I was there around that time, and the fear was insane. You couldn't, like, people said, don't walk down the street, because these people don't run the countries in anyone's interest. What they're about is they're US-backed regimes, which are about dampening down on any popular movements in the political system, but also in the grassroots. So people are getting killed a lot, and a lot of it was to do with mining companies and other companies which were agricultural companies, which were working in places where there were campesinos or small-scale farmers, or just opponents of those projects, and they'd just get killed. There was complete impunity, backed by the US. And you see this all through Latin America's history and other places too. There's a correlation between US involvement and US-backed regimes and human rights abuses. Because what the US wants is it wants the domestic elite to run that country in the interest of the United States and United States corporations. So Honduras was a really horrific example of that. I mean, Haiti, the poverty is insane, but the fear in Honduras was wild. And also, again, as I say, there was a brief little window of hope there. His wife is now president, by the way, so the hope has returned. But you see this again and again and again. And there's the longest chapter in the book is on Bolivia. Again, the whole chapter I looked into was the US trying to smash Evo Morales's government, again, which was a historic government for providing hope for the indigenous Bolivians for the first time since the Spanish came. Effectively, he was the first indigenous president, completely transformed society, was praised by the World Bank and the IMF. And the US was trying to destroy it, and almost did in 2008. Soon after he was elected, there was a attempted coup. Well, they tried to launch an autonomy drive in the east and shut down roads and stuff, but it failed. So the consequences are awful, and this is why we should be talking about it as the left. It should be one of the major issues we talk about. If the United States empire, alongside its allies, are the major counter-revolutionary reactionary force in the world today. Everywhere you see where hope, democratic socialism, people's movements rise up, the US is there to smash it down. And they have lots of different agencies to do that, again, which are heavily propagandized. Like, for example, in Honduras, they have a military base there called Sotocano. And they don't even call it a military base. They call it a forward operating location, which is meant to sound like it's temporary, but it's not temporary. And it gives them permanent control effectively over the country. And then you have organizations like the Drug Enforcement Administration, which again we're told is all about interdiction of drugs and clamping down on narco gangs. But again, it's not really. What it's about is about maintaining US control of these countries. The US doesn't care about drugs. Like they can, but they use the language of drugs to have another reason to station a huge military presence in Latin America. And it's not a coincidence that the drug war, in terms of its external aspect, really took off after the end of the Cold War, because they didn't have the Soviet threat as the excuse to station and basically colonize these countries anymore of the Soviet threat. So they used the drug war as the example, and it's a failure anyway. If you look at the Merida initiative in Mexico, Mexico's effectively large part, many states like Guerrero are run by drug cartels, and Calderon, who brought the military out to fight them, it hasn't been successful. In fact, it's been a massive disaster, hundreds of thousands of people dead. So all these policies are not. It needs to be understood. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, they all have nice ideologies which justify themselves, justify the organizations to the countries that they're in, and also to the people working within them. But if you start looking into the facts, it's not true. And what it's about is enforcing US control. And this is not a coincidence. It's not like there's empires have never done this. Like all empires have done this. And it's not, I'm not saying either that the Russians or the Chinese, we should believe their propaganda by default. That they're interested in extending their power, and their but we're allowed to talk about that in the mainstream media here. In fact, it's even promoted. If you open a newspaper, you'll always read articles about abuses of the Chinese or the Russians, which are real. I'm not saying they're not. They're not on the order of the United States anywhere near, but they are real. But what I want is us to be able to, and is us to take the US power and apply the same principles we apply to Chinese and Russian power to ourselves. And that is what is the red line. You can't do that. And the other point is, in terms of the consequences, which are horrific, as I've mentioned, that the US is the overriding force. The Chinese and the Russians, in terms of a global force, they have regional power, but in terms of a global hegemony, then they're nowhere near the United States. So we should be banging it on about it all the time and be unashamed, because as you mentioned, my previous book, Silent Coup, which is about corporations, which is a major part of the US empire, the whole system which extends their power is the US state, effectively. Like if a country wants to go do its own development model, or do a development model which benefits their people, it will be the CIA that will come in and try and subvert you. If they can't do that, then it will be the US military as a last resort, which will come and overthrow you by force. So those two things are linked, and also I think everything's changed with Gaza, hasn't it? Because that is almost the ultimate example of the reality of American foreign policy. Because Israel is a small country, population about the size of London, GDP smaller than Sweden. 80% of its arms come from the United States. It couldn't operate for a week without them. And you've had the Democratic president in the White House for 11 months coming out and supporting this genocide and arming this genocide. It's an American genocide. And I don't think, and the propaganda is really kind of being stretched about American benevolence and American or benign power, whatever it is, because people are looking and they're saying, and I'm not talking about political people, I'm talking about just the general public who are outraged by what's happening in Gaza. They're looking at their phones and seeing what is being done, and they're looking at Joe Biden, who they're told is the good guy, and Trump's the bad guy, and they're seeing Joe Biden say Israel has a right to defend itself, which is, it's not defending itself, it's committing a genocide, and then ventriloquizing all the Israeli propaganda about burned babies and put in the oven and all that kind of stuff. Mad stuff. And I think that the empire's never been this exposed, and because of the coverage within the media's never been exposed, because the people are looking at their phones about the reality and seeing the media lie about it as well. So the door is ajar for us, and we need to kick it in.
Yeah, and I mean, also India is also one of the suppliers of weaponry to Israel now. And not just that, I mean, India promised 10,000, I guess, workers to Israel to fill the gap left by Palestinians, which is atrocious. But the propaganda thing that you're talking about, it was so real in India, especially until a decade ago. We used to have access to all of these American shows that would sort of glorify American I guess, federal agents going into Latin America and fighting the drug war. And to us at that time, because we were quite impressionable, it really seemed like, oh, wow, this is such a huge, nice thing that the US is doing. Except that's when you start answering the questions that why would a country just do this out of the benevolence of their heart, or just it has to be something deeper. And these shows are so violent and just everywhere, and they would just sell merchandise, especially in India, because it's a huge market here. It's just, I mean, atrocious is a very small word, but also right now what's happening in Gaza, you can see the, like I love the word, the fingerprints of the US influence on our media as well. There are very small, I guess, a few channels who actually do want to cover what's happening in Gaza, and that too, a lot of them who are talking about what's happening in Gaza and the genocide, they can't do it directly, so they have to republish from, the Palestinian journalists. And it's such a tightrope that everybody has to walk. That, I mean, even for me at some point when I was publishing a few stories in the Internationalist, I was sort of warned by my colleagues, and they said, are you sure you want to do this? Especially because of India's stance. And I was like, it's fine. Just, if you don't do it, then it just gives them more power. And that's what you have to do, I guess, right now. All the journalists together have to take that power away from our oppressor. But you've talked about the institutions that the US sort of weaponizes when it comes to its foreign policy. And it does have some influence, I guess, a lot of influence in the Bretton Woods institutions, which have implemented, as you have detailed this in the Silent Coup as well, these economic programs that have really harmed economies and not so much as uplifted them. And despite these institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and their repeated failures of their economic programs, why do these institutions continue to persist? And I mean, is really the fact that we don't have a viable alternative the reason for their enduring influence today?
Yeah, well, effectively, the arms of the US, both those institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions were set up in Bretton Woods in 1944. Like the Second World War hadn't quite ended, but they were basically, it was a negotiation between the US and the UK, John Maynard Keynes for the UK and Dexter White Perkins for the US. And so they were, and they're both based in Washington. So they operate as an arm of this system, and they're set up to effectively enforce corporate-run societies, and that is what you see them do by force, effectively, because it's done by debt, but they do it by force. So IMF's about providing liquidity to countries that are in crisis, and what you saw in the 70s, they started these structural adjustment programs where they conditioned these bailouts effectively on the complete privatization of society, getting rid of all capital controls, privatizing public assets, cutting public sector investment, basically doing everything that would make those societies basically be run in the interests of corporations. And as you say, like it's been a failure pretty much everywhere it's been practiced. And before that, actually, in Latin America, they'd had this development model called, well, parts of it called import substitution, where they would keep out imports from other countries while their industries were developing, so that they wouldn't get undercut. And that was all destroyed by the structural adjustment programs. And then you had the debt crisis in the 1980s. So I say pretty much everywhere. Pretty much everywhere has been a disaster. The reason it continues, why to go to your question, is because they're not set up for development, even though they say they are. They're not set up to alleviate poverty, which is what the World Bank actually says. They're not set up for development. They're set up as a tool, an economic tool to enforce a specific way of running your economy, which is to run it in the interests of foreign capital and to run it in the interests of corporations. So it doesn't really matter. As you say, like all the evidence is in. They don't need any more evidence. They can look at Bolivia under Evo Morales. What happened? He did exactly what they told him not to do. He nationalized a whole host of industries within his first 100 days. He did massive investment in public infrastructure, health, education. And I think maybe the most successful period in any Latin American country's economic history for that period that he was in power, and it continues. It's still doing well, Bolivia, and eventually, because of the high growth rates and all that stuff, that he was praised by the IMF and World Bank for doing exactly what they told him not to do. And the way that the FT and Wall Street Journal get around this kind of contradiction is they say, well, the reason was because Evo Morales, and they say the same about Lula in his first incarnation, they oversaw a period where there was a commodities boom, so they benefited from that. But the obvious answer to that is, well, if there was a commodities boom under another president, they would have just allowed the corporations to take those materials out of the country paying zero tax or close to zero. And they would have done none of any money that they had got, which because of the increase in exports, would have been used just to ingratiate the oligarchy, which has traditionally had, which is why Bolivia is so poor 500 years after the Spanish came. Why it shouldn't be poor? It's got they took out. Eduardo Galeano famously said they took out enough gold from Latin America to build a bridge all the way back to Spain across the Atlantic. But so there's what they do sometimes have the answer to the fact that that their policies are a disaster, and they'll always find some justification. But essentially, to answer your question, they carry on doing it, and they're allowed to do it. Firstly, because they're not set up for development. They're not set up for what they say they are. And secondly, they're allowed to get away with it because the media just imbibes and diffuses their propaganda. There's hardly any critical analysis of this stuff in the mainstream media. In fact, close to zero. The only other places you might have found it once upon a time was like The Guardian in the UK context. But that's half of that's funded by the development site's funded by the Bill Gates Foundation and has been for years. And there's corporations all over the Guardian website. And they're signed up to the American Imperial Project as well in terms of ideologically. So so people don't know. And that's the way they like it. But when you start looking into it, when you start looking into the US empire, when you start looking into the IMF, the World Bank, you realize all the propaganda is essentially bunk. And the reason that they put it out there is because the reality is an ugly reality. And if people knew the ugly reality, they would not tolerate it. And there might be some force for change. To be honest with you, I think their propaganda system is collapsing, largely because of Gaza, but also because of the internet, because of social media and stuff. There's more and more ways people who are saying stuff outside of the mainstream can get their information out to mass audience, and that scares them. You see like a crackdown massively. So there's reasons for hope amidst all the horror.
Yeah, and I think I feel like today is the time when it is for journalists and anybody working with media to really, really crack down on combating this kind of propaganda, which is prevalent everywhere. And I think it's only when we do that, it's only, when we have this information and we have this knowledge and we are participating in spreading and learning all of this is when we will be able to, I guess, come up with an alternative solution, to institutions such as these, right?
Yeah. Nothing's more important for the empire than keeping the discourse, controlling the discourse. Because as soon as they lose control of the discourse, it just will start unraveling. Because the truth is very, very different, and people don't. And this is why I think Gaza is important, because I think Gaza's exposed the lies more than anything I've ever seen. And people don't stop at Gaza. They don't stop at one thing. When they've realized that they've been lied to about Israel and Palestine and Gaza for their whole lives, they don't think, okay, well, I've been lied to about that. That's just a one-off. They think, okay, well, that's probably because they're lying to me about everything, and then they start investigating other stuff, like what is the IMF? What does it do? Is it about helping countries develop and get out of crisis, or is it about something else? So hopefully, I think it's in terms of the ideological system, Gaza might be a turning point. It certainly feels like that just on a personal level when I talk to people. People can't quite believe that the Western powers have backed this solidly for 11 months. But we'll see what
And
happens.
even before that, I think even before October 7, Israel was so well supported by all of the major powers in the world.
Yeah. Well, it's a British creation. Balfour Declaration was 1917, and then during the British Mandate of Palestine, they basically allowed large-scale immigration by the Jewish community, and with the view that Israel would be created. They would argue not along the lines of what happened, but it's a British creation. And since then, yes, it's been. But I do think the support is bigger now than it's ever been, because even in the 80s, for example, Margaret Thatcher did an arms embargo on Israel. That's unthinkable. We just blocked, Keir Starmer's government just blocked or cancelled 30 or suspended 30 arms licenses, but it comprises 8%. Margaret Thatcher, who's obviously also a conservative and quite an extreme conservative at that, she did a full embargo on Israel in 1982 after the invasion of Lebanon. So that's unthinkable now. So I do think the control of Israel, of our political system, has increased massively. But maybe that will change over the coming generation, because I don't think the impact of this is going to go away for many, many years. It's going to play out for years and years and years.
I agree with you on that. Although, I mean, the change that I'm seeing is not so quite swift, at least not in this part of the world. I guess also because we are living in times when, the pro-Hindutva forces are stronger than ever, and the Modi government's trolls are everywhere on the internet, especially on, Twitter, spaces like Twitter. And, this is coming from the part where, India was one of the first countries to recognize Palestine. And then here we are today, so staunchly behind Israel. I mean, I do hope for change, but I'm not sure if it's going to come really swiftly, because a lot of the media here in India, it's just so saturated by the voices from Israel and from the US and from the Britain, that the voices that are in fact are talking about, the genocide are just so far and few in between, and also being swiftly shut down as soon as, they come up. So, I mean, I am keeping my fingers crossed. But yeah, and, just to sort of wrap up this discussion, if you're comfortable at all, would you like to tell us if you're investigating anything right now that you would like to share with us?
Well, most of the work we've been doing at Declassified UK, where I work, over the past nearly year now, has been about the British role in Gaza, because it's huge. But also, like all these things, it's a window into how the system operates that we've been talking about. So a lot of the stories I've been working on have been about Britain's base on Cyprus. It has a number of bases, but one particular one. But again, what's the story of that base in Cyprus? Well, Cyprus got independence from Britain in 1960, but it didn't get independence. It was a lie, really. We retained 3% of the landmass, which we turned into massive military and intelligence installations to control the Middle East. Number one. Number two, the way that the UK made itself useful to the Americans and became part of the American imperial project, which took over from the British, was we made these bases that we retained around the world open to the United States, and they can do what they want. So fast forward to last year after October 7th, and you see that the base in Cyprus is being used by the United States secretly to deliver arms to Israel to carry out the genocide in Gaza. And again, all this stuff is not being covered in the mainstream media. So the stories I did about Cyprus actually caused a major incident in Cyprus in terms of like the president of Cyprus had to make a comment. The president of Northern Cyprus, which was illegally occupied in 1974, he had to make a statement. Then there was huge protests in Limassol, which is the second city of Cyprus, and at the base that I'm talking about, which is called RAF at Kriteri. All this happened because of our independent journalism, which we're small. And the mainstream media never even covered the presidents making statements, which was kind of shocking as well. So we're doing more work on that and different parts about it. But again, to go back to that point I made before, which is about how Gaza is exposing the system. They've had to reveal themselves. Like what's the real thing about what's the real story of Cyprus? Well, most people didn't know, weren't even aware that Britain had bases there. But people know now because they had to use them to deliver arms. And the other thing is, if you go to I've been to those bases. If you go to the areas that they're on, although they're 3% of the landmass of Cyprus, so they're big areas. They're not just bases. People live there and stuff. But there's no flags. There's no you don't know you're going over a border, and that's for a reason. They want to keep the fact that there's just this effectively colonies. They are colonies still on Cyprus. They want to keep it under the carpet. And I even interviewed people on those they're called sovereign base areas. I interviewed tourists and stuff, and I said, "Do you know you're on British territory now?" They're like looking up some flamingos in the lake or whatever. I'm like, no, we're in Britain. So this whole system operates off the books for the media, for the general public, and it has to, because imperialism never died. It was repackaged, and they had to repackage it. They didn't do it out of choice. There were independence movements, liberation movements, which forced them to, and we were fed the lie that it was all decommissioned. These places were granted independence, but they weren't. They were controlled by other means, and the empire still exists. And the empire is the major enemy of anyone who wants progressive change in this world and wants people to have power over their own resources, because it's all about ingratiating a corporate elite in the United States. And hopefully eyes are being opened in a way that they haven't before. And we as the left and people who are interested in truth need to be ready to step in and provide some analytical framework for people to understand how the world really works when they realize they've been lied to for decades and decades and decades.
Yeah. And yeah, the imperialization never really ended.
No.
That's so true. And you've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure our readers too. So, I mean, I would like to thank you again for your time,
Of course.
and for sharing your insights. And I mean, congratulations on the new edition of your book.
Appreciate it.
And yeah, we would love to have you again
Of course.
in the future. But yeah, before we sign off, I would just like to tell our readers to subscribe to The Internationalist so that we can have more conversations with Matt like this one. Thank you, Matt.
Right, take care. Nice to see you, Tanya.